share some good stories. I want to introduce our teacher for this morning. This is Heather Douglas. Many of you know Heather. But one of the things we love at North City is a multiplicity of voices in our teaching spaces. Not only in the discussions we have around the table, but the voices that lead us in those discussions. And I'm so grateful for Heather's giftedness and the teaching that she has for us this morning that will help us think more deeply about what it means to follow Jesus. So let's give Heather a huge round of applause.
Thank you. I'm excited to be able to share with you today. My husband, Brian, and then my 3 kids, we've been coming to North City for about a year and a half. So actually, I would love to hear a couple answers of what people shared for one at a time. Yes, please share.
Oh, baby.
Yes, a baby. There is a very pregnant Valley in the room. Does anybody else want to share a time that they had to wait for something that they really wanted?
A nap.
A nap. That's fair, that's fair.
I'll share.
Yeah.
It took me 8 years to get a puppy.
Oh, and now you have PJ. All right, well, let me paint a picture for you of a time that we had to wait. So the year is 2020. We have a 15-month-old Remy, who we adopted at birth, and an 8-month-old Thea, who I gave birth to. And so naturally, this felt like a great time for us to start the adoption process again. So we knew this process could take a while, so we went ahead and we applied to an agency, started working on our home study. And just to give you some context, when we adopted our first daughter, Remy, the whole process took about 9 months from beginning to end. So we got chosen by the second mom that we presented our profile book to, and it was only 2 weeks after we were home study approved. So it was a super quick process. There was hardly any waiting and really not much uncertainty. With the second adoption, things were already starting to look pretty different. We were on a wait list for a year. And then over the next 20 months, we heard over 20 no's from expectant mothers. We finally heard a yes from a mom who lived in California and was pregnant with a baby boy. But after about a month of getting to know her, we experienced a heartbreaking and confusing disruption. Around this time, we were also presented with the potential opportunity to adopt a toddler from foster care, but that also ended in a dead end. So thankfully, shortly after these 2 disappointments, we were chosen to be the parents to our now son, Carver, by his birth mom. And so we went to Michigan about a month later to wait for his birth, but even that time was fraught with anxiety and uncertainty. So if you were doing the math, and don't worry, I've got you covered if you weren't, it was almost 3 years from the time we began the adoption process until we were able to bring our son, Carver, home. Throughout those years, I doubted, I panicked, I cried, I went numb, I pleaded, I gave up. I pretty much felt the whole gamut of emotions. Some of you ladies might remember some of these dominant emotions, as we like to call them in our Wednesday night women's group. Whenever I would think too long about the possibility of not adding this third longed-for child into our family, I would spiral. Those hard emotions that I was feeling made me susceptible to believing lies about who God is and about who I am. So the questions I faced were, how do I stay afloat when life throws me challenging or even heartbreaking circumstances? How do I not let my thoughts and my emotions completely spiral out of control? And how do I not let my circumstances and the way I feel about them dominate my life? So there's a story from Jesus' time on earth with his disciples that I think that can help answer some of these questions. And that story is found in Matthew 14:22 through 33. If you want to look it up, pull it up. Otherwise, JD's got it on the screen for us. So this story, it takes place right after the feeding of the 5,000, which is the first of 2 recorded times that Jesus performs a miracle like this, where he feeds a large crowd from virtually nothing. This time with 5 loaves and 2 fish from a young boy. So then that brings us to our story in Matthew 14:22 through 33. says, immediately he made the disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side while he dismissed the crowds. And after he had dismissed the crowds, he went up on the mountain by himself to pray. When evening came, he was there alone, but the boat by this time was a long way from the land, beaten by the waves, for the wind was against them. And in the fourth watch of the night, he came to them, walking on the sea. But when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified and said, "It is a ghost," and they cried out in fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them, saying, "Take heart, it is I, do not be afraid." And Peter answered him, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." He said, "Come." So Peter got out of the boat and walked on the water and came to Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid, and beginning to sink, he cried out, "Lord, save me." Jesus immediately reached out his hand and took hold of him, saying to him, "O you of little faith, why did you doubt?" And when they got into the boat, the wind ceased, and those in the boat worshipped him, saying, "Truly, you are the Son of God." So often we pause after reading of the story and just would love to hear if anybody in the crowd has a reaction to what was just read, or what's maybe standing out to you. Plus, I get a chance to drink some water.
Jesus immediately said, "Come." He said, "Okay, give me this time.
Mm-hmm.
I need to do it."
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, George.
I was watching the train and anticipating the end, because normally they have to have another locomotive on the end.
All right.
I like that the disciples thought it was a ghost because I don't know, it just makes me think of like even back in Bible times.
Totally. Thanks. So yeah, like I mentioned, right before this walking on the water took place, Jesus had just fed 5,000, and then he sent his disciples ahead of him across the lake in a boat, and then he dismissed the crowds. As he often was known to do, Jesus then went off by himself to pray to his Father. He went on a mountain to pray in preparation for what lay ahead. Jesus was heading into Gentile regions for ministry and would soon be facing the many trials in Jerusalem. As he was praying on the mountain by himself, the boat full of disciples was a long way from the land, it says. Scholars believe about 3 miles into a 4 to 5 mile wide lake. They were fighting waves and wind all night, probably around 9 hours at this point, which must have been exhausting after a long day of ministering to the crowds. During the fourth watch of the night, which would have been between 3 and 6 a.m., Jesus decides to join the disciples. So he does this by walking on the water. Walking on the water. I feel like in this day and age, we have things like water skis and water jetpacks and special effects in movies, and some of those things might have sort of numbed us to the incredible nature of this miracle. But it was truly amazing to behold. It was so unbelievable that, like Kara said, the only thing that the disciples could come up with was that they were seeing a ghost. But Jesus was quick to quiet their fears by saying, "Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid." "It is I" is the same phrase that Jesus actually uses many times to claim deity. Essentially, he was saying, "I am," which is the personal name of God that was spoken to Moses and would be instantly recognized by Jews, his disciples, as claiming that he himself was God. He reassures the disciples that the Lord is with them, and therefore they have nothing to fear. So here's where Peter comes in, and I love him for it. He was emboldened by seeing Jesus on the water, and he trusted that Jesus was who he said he was. So he asked Jesus to tell him to come out onto the water. Now remember, this is choppy water with high waves, high wind. It's not a nice glassy lake where you can just swim if you start to sink. But at Jesus' one word, "Come," Peter stepped out onto the water. He walked on the water toward Jesus, But when he took his eyes off of Jesus and onto the wind and waves, he started to sink. The object of his gaze was what kept him afloat amidst the waves. When Peter called out to be saved, Jesus immediately reached out his hand to help him. Just as Jesus was quick to calm the disciples' fears, he was quick to respond to Peter's cry for help. Although Peter had more faith than the other disciples to go out on the water, Jesus still rebuked him for having little faith. Peter still allowed the wind and waves to make his faith waver. When they got into the boat, the wind stopped, which was another miracle. So the disciples were just witnessing miracle after miracle. The feeding of the 5,000 was probably in the back of their heads this whole time. Then they saw Jesus walk on the water, Jesus enabled Peter to walk on the water, and Jesus stilling the storm. They responded in worship, calling Jesus the Son of God, which is the only recorded time in Matthew that the disciples gave Jesus this title. And I think it really points to the incredible nature of this miracle and how deeply it affected the disciples. So back to those years of waiting and wondering as we were in the adoption process. I was presented with countless opportunities to take my eyes off of Jesus and onto my uncertain circumstances. I was tempted to let my emotions swirl out of control and dictate my thoughts and actions. And I often gave in to that temptation. But truly, the only time I felt like I wasn't sinking during those years of waiting was when I took my eyes off of my circumstances and off of how I was feeling and set them on Jesus. Like Peter, when I trusted that Jesus was all-powerful and would only call me into something that he would sustain me through, I was able to stay afloat despite the wind and the waves. But when I would look at the wind and focus solely on my circumstances, I would start to sink into unhealthy thought patterns and destructive behaviors. What I've realized is that there is a war in my mind and that how I think shapes how I live. What or who I choose to gaze at has huge implications for my life. So if how we think shapes how we live and how we think is shaped by what our gaze is fixed on, then the question it all comes down to is, what are you fixated on? What are you fixated on? Are you gazing at Jesus? Are you trusting in Jesus? Are you so focused on him that you don't notice the wind and the waves? Or are you gazing at your circumstances? Are you allowing fear to creep in and steal your trust? Are you focused on what you wish would change more than the one who can change it? The good news is, if you realize that you've been gazing at your circumstances, it's never too late to turn your eyes to Jesus. And thankfully, when it comes to what we think, we have a choice and we have a helper. We can choose to think the truth rather than lies. We can choose to avert our eyes back to Jesus rather than keeping them on our circumstances. And as we choose these things, we can ask the Holy Spirit, the helper, to empower us, to give us the strength and the steadfastness needed to keep our gaze on Jesus. And even when it feels impossible, as I'm sure it did for Peter, to not look at those waves, the Spirit will help us just as readily as Jesus helped Peter. We don't have to do this on our own, and we can partner with and surrender to the Spirit as we train our hearts and our minds to focus on Jesus. So you might be wondering, what does this look like practically? Well, guess what? I have a fancy little tool to share with you. So a tool that I have found really helpful recently in training the way that I think are these thought spirals. These are from Jenny Allen's book called Get Out of Your Head. And so Jenny talks about our emotions and thoughts spiraling either downward or upward. So you can see on the left, there's the arrow is going down, and on the right, the arrow is going up. So naturally, when we experience emotions such as fear, discontentment, anger, etc., we have a thought that defines why we're feeling that way or what we can do to stop feeling that way. That thought then dictates how we act, which impacts our relationships and everything else about our lives. So as you can see, on the left, it goes down, on the right, it goes up. And the only difference is simply in the choice that we make when we first notice an emotion we're feeling and what we think next. So when we feel an emotion, we have a choice. We can choose to believe a lie or the truth. We can choose to spiral downward into unhealthy behaviors and way of relating, or we can choose to disrupt our thought patterns with the truth, leading to healthy choices and ways of relating. So if you want to go to the next slide, So a little bit fuzzy, I apologize for that, but I wanted to show you an example. So here's the framework with discontentment being the starting emotion. So if you look to the upper left, this is going to show kind of the negative downward spiral with discontentment starting as the emotion. So as we were in the process of adopting, there were many times when I felt discontent. I didn't like waiting. I didn't like not knowing what our family would look like. And there were many times that I would fall for the lie that I'd feel better if I stayed distracted. So the thought, I'll feel better if I stay distracted. That led to the behavior of constant inputs, which for me looked like Instagram and Netflix. Anyone else? Maybe the good like fantasy novel if you're kind of nerdy. Which led to relationships that were needy and frantic since I'm filling my time with other things than time with people, and ended up with insecurity as a consequence. But if you see on the right, when I would feel that discontent emotion and instead chose to be still and not run to the noise and distraction of social media or TV, those times of prayer and stillness with God are some of my most precious times during those 3 years of waiting. And it produced calming and reassuring relationships as well as security. So there's just a little example. That framework, you can use it for any time in your life. As you feel emotions pop up, you can recognize and name them, then partner with the Spirit to choose to think the truth. And as you choose to fix your eyes on Jesus, your circumstances and emotions about them will no longer dominate your life, but rather God's peace will guide you through the choppy waters. So this has made a big difference in my life, especially recently, but we want to give you guys a little bit of time to process at your tables. So if you can find 1 to 3 people around you, we'll give you about 10 minutes. So if each person just shares for a couple minutes, so everybody has some time to share, and it's totally acceptable if you just want to take this time to listen as well.